Studying the evolution and progression of the 5 roles in League is truly fascinating if you have a modicum of interest in history. With each role having its own internal meta and playstyles independent of each other, it only makes it more curious to see how they all compile together. Top, jungle, mid, and to a lesser extent support have gone through drastic changes over the years. I'd argue if a player from Season 3, 4, or even 5 were to come back in any of the 4, the game would be almost unrecognizable to them. But the lane that maintained its current conditions for the longest would have to be bot lane, being the premier and, for a while, exclusive site of the majority of marksman champions. There was no other role whose roster was more dominated by a single class than bot lane, and there never will be. As more and more champions were released and Riot became more ambitious about making every role as diverse as possible, bot lane held fast, not necessarily due to in-game circumstances. Conceptually speaking, there's no tangible difference between top and bot lane. Everyone more or less colloquially agreed to put 2 champions in the lane closest to the dragon pit and realized that AD carries were the ones in most need of external support to get them past their fragile early game. That is to say, the internment of marksmen down in bot lane was the result of meta and nothing more. For many years, that's all you would see down there, but following a series of controversial changes to crit items that was eventually reverted in Season 7, players began to explore possible alternatives to the AD carry role, positing if said carry even needed to be a physical damage dealer. Understanding that on occasion, top, jungle, and mid lane would prefer to go AD, that left only the bot lane to serve as their team's magic damage. The problem was, there aren't a whole lot of magic damage marksmen, and the few who existed back then were not all that fun to play for most people. A few who were brazen enough to try something new began to experiment with a few mages that could potentially fill in those shoes, bringing to life a small yet noticeable group of champions commonly referred to as Mage or AP bot laners. Today we'll be discussing these champions, how they work, and why they might be even stronger than marksmen themselves when played correctly. Something you may notice when looking at a lot of tier lists is that while their play rates are measurably lower than traditional AD carries, their win rate statistics are quite good. For example, in Diamond Plus, over the past half a dozen patches or so, maybe more, Karthus, Ziggs, Veigar, and Seraphine have perennially maintained a win rate of over 50%, with Karthus being the single highest winning bot laner without fail each and every version. To reiterate, his disproportionately high standing may be a result of a low sample size and those choosing to play him fully committing to that playstyle, but be that as it may, it is a sufficient enough sample size to pose the question of a viable if not effective choice. Alongside the occasional AP builds from marksmen who could afford to do so like Twitch, Kai'Sa, Kog'Maw, and Vars, there are 5 mages that you may run into in bot lane: Swain, Karthus, Veigar, Ziggs, and Seraphine. This past March and April we saw a significant rise in Veigar after receiving very helpful buffs to his ability range in 13.4. Now before going any further, we should establish what allows them to find success down in a lane that's much longer than mid, and is a 2v2 lane, not a solo one. There are 3 things needed to be a functional AP bot laner, although most of the time you can get by on just 2. Additionally, the priorities of an AP bot laner are different from an AD one. Rather than focusing on pure damage, mages prefer to achieve control, enabling them and their team to exert pressure while hindering the enemy team. To start, wave clear. AP bot laners have to be just as good as, if not better than marksmen at pushing waves to make up for their poor 1v1 damage. In most circumstances, if caught in single combat, AP bot laners will lose to basically every marksman in the game. To navigate around that, they need consistently strong pushing power at all stages of the game to not only ensure they have lane priority but prevent their opponent from using waves as cover. For example, thanks to the mana refund passive on Defile, Karthus can generally spam Q on the wave, which can attack multiple minions at once and harass the enemy laners at the same time. Ziggs has 4 damaging abilities. Short Fuse gives his autos an extra kick, while Bouncing Bomb and Explosive Minefield run through minions reasonably well. Maybe during the beginning of laning phase before they get their hands on AP items, they'll struggle a bit, but likewise, all marksmen, even those with good wave clear like Sivir, also struggle with pushing waves early. The clear speed of AP bot laners tends to outscale that of marksmen in the late game, while doubling as dangerous long-range pressure in neutral. By 2 or 3 items, you have to start accounting for the fact that getting hit by a Seraphine high note beat drop combo, initially intended to push a lane, can slash a squishy champion's health bar in half. The one exception to this is Veigar, whose push power isn't anything to write home about, but it still scales very well later on when Dark Matter starts to one-shot even melee minions. The second aspect is DPS, and not just any DPS, but area-centric DPS. Karthus, Ziggs, and Swain have low enough cooldowns and or a persistent ability that behaves as the equivalent of an AD carry's auto attack damage. For Karthus, I already talked about how Lay Waste effectively replaces his basic attack. Couple that with Defile and he has some of the best damage output of any mage in the game, especially since he gets 7 seconds of free attack time when dead. As for Ziggs, Bouncing Bomb's cooldown drops to 4 seconds at rank 5. Seeing as he builds a decent amount of ability haste, you can expect it to go down to 3 or even 2 seconds, so he can continuously chuck bombs over and over. That and the fact that all of his abilities deal AoE damage. Face rolling over your keyboard during a team fight can pile on the hurt really quickly. Swain's Death's Hand has an extremely low cooldown and fantastic area coverage, as well as a continuous damage and sustain from Demonic Ascension, provided he's damaging at least one enemy champion, of course. Vhagar takes a while to get going, but eventually Dark Matter becomes very spammable, and lest you forget, he kinda reaches a point where he starts two-shotting everyone. Seraphine may not be as mashy, but she makes up for that with the best teamfight pressure among AP bot laners, and pushes waves really easily, ensuring she can hold down a neutral state even if she's the only one with wave clear on her team. Third aspect is neutral. Neutral is really what separates AP bot laners from marksmen. While there are a few that enjoy staying really far back and poking you down like Ezreal, Ashe, and Vars, marksmen generally have subpar neutral games on account of their threat range not being far enough to deter enemy engage. The average marksman has 550 attack range, but if you look at most melee champions' dashes, theirs matches or exceeds that. Wukong's dash has a range of 625, Xin Zhao has 650 or 1100, Diana's is 825, Jax is 700 to name a few. AP bot laners on the other hand have a lot more range for their means of pressure. Karthus Q has 875, Swain Q is only 725, but he usually opens up a never move to prevent enemies from dashing anyway. The same applies for Vhagar. They buffed his Baleful Strike and Dark Matter to have almost 1000 range each, but the threat of getting trapped in Event Horizon is in and of itself an engaged deterrent. Seraphine and Ziggs have significantly more range than most champions can respond to, and they both have ways to counter anyone who attacks recklessly. Ziggs is Satchel Charge, while Seraphine has double cast speed drop, or single cast can work too if she has Rylai's. That's another thing, since AP bot laners tend to have naturally built-in crowd control on their attacks, engaging on them is deceptively tricky. Marksmen seldom have hard CC, and any who do usually have it on their ultimates, or as a situation like an off-me tool. Meanwhile, AP bot laners can layer their crowd control within their normal attack rotation, putting a lot more pressure on the enemy team in neutral. In a contest of raw DPS, AD carries will always win, but AP carries can circumvent that by making it onerous for them to do so, or by supplying additional help for their team, and it's also what makes them surprisingly consistent even if they fall behind, leading me to the title of this video. Most bot laners aren't keen on playing AP carries due to them being considered boring, especially in the early game, and you'd be hard pressed to not agree. The biggest downside of mages in general is their vulnerable early game, not unlike marksmen. They take a while to get going until around the 2-item mark where they possess adequate stores of mana, sufficiently low cooldowns, and enough damage for one rotation to really start hurting, which means the majority of early game has to be spent patiently and painstakingly farming and holding the line, all while you have to account for not one, but 2 lane opponents who are likely viciously trying to kill you in light of how weak you are in the early game. Even against so-called weak early game marksmen like Jinx and Aphelios, the advantage they have is base damage. Most mage abilities at rank 1 do less damage than 2 auto attacks from a marksman, but that early on in the game, they can throw out 4 or 5 autos for every 1 cast of your abilities. It's not until rank 4 or 5 when 1 cast of Q, for example, equates to 2 or 3 autos from them. And there's also the issue of your abilities not doing enough damage to push waves fast enough without draining your mana. However, one weakness a large number of bot laners have, which Riot has made attempts to alleviate, is their subpar mid game. AD carries have a strange power curve, where their early game is actually not too bad thanks to their range advantage, and we all know how good they are at 5 or 6 items. Where they struggle the most is mid game. Kindly take a look at this very crudely mapped graph featuring 2 lines. The blue line represents auto attackers while the red line represents ability casters. In a general sense, the pace at which an ability caster progresses in strength tends to be linear, while the pace at which an auto attacker progresses in strength tends to be exponential. The reason for that is because there are more parameters that strengthen auto attacks than abilities, unless of course said ability has more than one means of scaling. Auto attacks can be made stronger through attack damage, on-hit effects like Blade of the Ruined King or Rage Blade, attack speed, crit rate, and crit damage, 5 different metrics. For most abilities, the only way they get stronger is through either attack damage or ability power and then ability haste. So for the sake of argument, let's use Annie's Disintegrate. It can only be made stronger through AP and ability haste, that's it. But Disintegrate has base damage, 220 at rank 5 or level 9. By level 9, you can't find a single marksman in the entire game who has 250 plus AD. I don't care who they are. So one cast of Disintegrate is like 2 or even 3 auto attacks, assuming the NA player has at least 1 item at that point. Moreover, abilities can be layered one after another, known as burst rotation. By the mid-game, marksman autos are starting to ramp up in damage and frequency, but are still behind abilities by virtue of the latter having base damage and being comboable. It's not until around 4 completed items or more when one marksman auto matches one ability cast in damage, and then when they get 2.5 attack speed they can machine gun you down in like 4 hits. That is, if they get to that point. Mages may have a comparatively weaker early game than marksmen, but their mid-game 1 and 2 item power spike is way more substantial than the vast majority of marksmen, even early gamers like Draven. Eventually, at full build versus full build, AD carries do beat out AP carries, but realistically, how many games get to that point? And even then, mages bring with them the aforementioned strengths that make up the difference. Control, more area coverage, usually better wave clear, more crowd control, more range, etc. What makes these 5 champions in particular viable choices in bot lane is that they tend to look more like this. Comparing the two images, the point where the blue line overtakes the red is much later in the game. Karthus, Swain, and Veigar also never really fall off as they do so much freaking damage courtesy of their AoE, or in Veigar's case infinite scaling, that while their single target damage is not as good, they can kill everyone simultaneously, so it's a moot point. Overall, I think it's a good thing that mages are now a decently common sight in bot lane. ADC mains are not really a fan of them because AP bot laners are among the most annoying champs to fight since they spend most of the early game chucking stuff at you and sitting under tower. But with most marksmen being exclusively physical damage before Twitch, Kai'Sa and whatnot started running AP on occasion, it placed the onus on the mid laner most of the time to supply magic damage for the team, even though the circumstances in bot lane are actually quite ideal for mages. Their support provides adequate protection for them as they get to the mid game power spike, sometimes almost too easily, which is the main balance dilemma concerning this group. Mages get all the benefits of ability casters and the privileges of being ranged at the same time. To offset this, they're extremely easy to exploit in the early game. Oftentimes you see a Zed or Katarina roam bot lane to score a gank, then the enemy team spam pings their Victor or Vladimir mid on why they didn't roam to respond. But rotating along with them would be tantamount to suicide. The last thing you want to do is walk away from the safety of your turret and minions and face check a brush against an assassin. Now, in bot lane, even though you're still an easy target for junglers and engaged supports, and even though bot lane is the longer lane with more entry points, you at least have someone else who can alleviate the pressure of early game to a degree, giving you a safer lane. Those with enough DPS or control to contest marksmen would be remiss to not avail those privileges. Then again, it can be very frustrating for you, the Jinx or Draven or Tristana player, to get a lead early game only to still get out-pressured by the enemy Ziggs in the mid game purely from his superior base damage and range. That's not to say AP bot laners are guaranteed to perform well mid-game. If they fall behind, they have to work twice as hard to get back into it, but being able to do more than just output damage is what makes them such an underrated class. Unless your name is Ashe or Vars, just about every other marksman in the game exists for the sole purpose of damage. That's where the moniker of AD carry originated from. But we live in an age where damage is not in short supply, therefore it's likely that the siege power of Ziggs, the vision control of Swain, the shielding and wombo combo of Seraphine, or the zoning pressure of Veigar may prove to be more beneficial for the team than however much damage Vayne or Samira does. It does take some getting used to though. Support players who are unfamiliar with the threat capacities of mage bot laners may come off with a bad impression of them. But I feel like it's in most bot laners' best interest to have at least a pocket Veigar or Ziggs on the off chance that you either A, need a source of magic damage, or B, want to feel useful even if you fall behind, because we all know how useless AD carries are when they go 0-5. Bot cap, am I right? In the end, I think mage AD carries are underrated to all hell, and I'm honestly surprised we don't see more of them. You do have to be selective with who you pick though. Playing Vladimir or Ken in bot lane is kind of troll. But for the 5 champions I spent this video talking about, I often find them performing better than standard AD carries. Anyways, that's gonna be it for today. If you have any thoughts on mage bot laners, feel free to share them in the comments down below. As always, if you enjoyed the video, it would be great if you left a like and subscribed. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter at VarsFerm, join my Discord server, and check out my other group champion discussions if you haven't yet. But for now, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you again soon in the next one. Take care.